Thank you for joining us. I'm Ben Lima of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. And I'm here with Dr. Whitney Stewart, who's Assistant Professor of Historical Studies at UT Dallas and an affiliate of the O'Donnell Institute. Our conversation today is part of the series Falling and Rising, Public Monuments and Cultural Heritage in a Time of Protest. Just a few of Dr. Stewart's many honors and accomplishments include the books Race and Nation in the Age of Emancipations from University of Georgia Press, which she co-edited, as well as This is Our Home, The Struggle for Home Place on Southern Plantations, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press, along with fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Antiquarian Society, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you so much for being with us.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I thought we could start by just asking if you could talk a little bit about your research into plantation sites and these ideas of home and how that's constructed, maybe a little bit about the methodology that you use and the kind of questions that you're trying to answer.
Sure. So the book monograph that I'm working on right now, This is Our Home, The Struggle for Home Place on Southern Plantations, explores the ways that enslaved people and enslaving residents of Southern plantations in the antebellum United States sought to make home amidst the extreme constraints of the institution of slavery. And I say attempt and sought to make home, in part because it was nearly impossible for enslaved people to be able to create fully what they desired of their home place. A sense of privacy and security, a sense of family, a sense of legacy, because of the limitations, both legal, political, social, placed upon them as they were bound to enslaving men and women. So when I'm looking at how enslaved people attempted to make home on Southern plantations, I'm looking at the physical remnants of this homemaking, what I call homemaking. And this is where my methodology becomes really important, because instead of the ways that many historians understandably seek out the past through written sources, many of which we have in archives and in libraries, even sometimes in people's attics and basements, I am looking for other ways of understanding the past. I'm looking for the material remnants. I'm looking for even the textual remnants that tell us about the material. So archaeological research is really important for my work. It allows me to get at what enslaved people were making, what they were wielding and using, what they were discarding in the home places, generally throughout the plantation, but also the extant buildings and landscapes that are on Southern plantations that still exist today. Those are another really important part of the research that I do to try to understand how enslaved people actually manipulated the world around them to try to create a sense of home and home feeling amidst the difficulties in which they were constantly living. And so I go, of course, to archives and libraries like the American Antiquarian Society, like Huntington Library, but I also go to places like the National Museum for African American History and Culture, very important part of my work. But almost more important than anything has been the trips that I take to plantations that are in existence today. I get to, get a sense of what they're doing to understand the past at these places, but I also get a sense of what's left behind for me to try to understand this history, whether it be materials that were dug up by archaeologists, buildings that are left extant, and the ability to, as much as possible, get a sense from descendant communities in places like Durham, North Carolina, or Orange County, Virginia, where there are generations of descendants of enslaved people who were living nearby the plantations on which their ancestors were enslaved. So I try to get a full range, both of the textual, the material, and the oral history of how enslaved people were trying to make home.
That sounds incredibly rich. I thought I could maybe ask if, as you mentioned, you've done research on a number of sites. I saw that you gave a talk about research on the Montpelier Plantation. And I was wondering if maybe you could tell us about a trip or a research period at maybe one particular place, kind of how you go into it, how you approach it, and maybe kinds of things you find, or maybe like unexpected discoveries, or what you kind of learn as you go, I guess.
Yeah, I have to say right off the bat, the work that public historians are doing to preserve and tell the history of enslaved people and enslavers on these sites is absolutely essential for the work that I do, and also essential for the work that I hope we as historians are trying to do more in engaging with broader communities. Mm-hmm. They're working to ensure more than ever that the enslaved residents of these sites, their stories, their history is not only included in the plantation tour, but is actually at the forefront. So Montpelier Plantation is an excellent example of this. This was James and Dolly Madison's plantation. So it's very much connected to a particular person, and a very well-known person, and a well-known person who, well, just, for instance, wrote the Constitution. So a lot is known about James Madison when people come to Montpelier, but what they are doing to foreground the lives of enslaved people, they had this incredible exhibit called No Mere Distinction of Color. And they are working to really make sure that the individual lives and the individual stories of enslaved people are told alongside that of James and Dolly Madison. They have recreated what's called the South Yard, which is the yard right next to the mansion where many of the domestic enslaved laborers lived and worked. They've actually recreated that, so now you can see what that relationship, that spatial relationship was like between the buildings. That for me was really, that was a mind-blowing experience, because if you went there before, you wouldn't have seen the ways that these buildings interact with each other, and thus individuals interacted with each other. But as I was researching and then writing my chapter on Montpelier, which really is about the ways that enslaved people were creating a sense of home as separate from labor, and creating a sense of privacy even amongst being within the surveillance scope of the Madisons. If I wouldn't have been able to see, well, if the Madisons stand on this terrace, they could see directly into the South Yard, they could surveil it at any time, I wouldn't have really known what that felt like for the enslaved people who are actually living and laboring there. And it wouldn't have given me the same kind of and of course, it's different now than it was in 1810, but it wouldn't have given me the same sense of the experience for either the enslaver or the enslaved people that I would have had otherwise. So the work that public historians are doing, both to push forward the enslaved people's experiences in the interpretation, but also things like reconstructing slave cabins when so few of them are still in existence, or embarking on archaeological work. Montpelier is another example. They have multiple archaeologists on staff, and they work with the public. They bring people in to do digs. So it excites people. I mean, like, people are, it's like Indiana Jones, but in America. And it's so exciting because you get to go and you get to actually dig in the ground. You find buttons, and you find beads, and you find half of a fork, and you think, like, what are these things that have been here for 200 plus years? How were they used? Who used them? And it's just so exciting for me as a scholar, but also the fact that they're bringing the public in to do this kind of work. They're connecting, and that's awesome.
That's I can imagine people, kids or anyone just being really thrilled to do something like that.
Exactly.
That what you're describing, that sounds like a very frankly positive, successful approach that's being taken. And I know that I guess it hasn't always been that way. And I think maybe you mentioned at one point that even when you were maybe growing up and visiting some of these places, or it was a little different, or I wondered if you could speak to maybe how the approaches have evolved recently. I know that, to say the least, that the enslaved people's experience weren't always fairly represented, or I just wonder if you could give a sense of kind of what's making that change and how that's progressing.
Yeah. That is an incredibly interesting story to me. So my book is very much rooted in the antebellum era, from the late 18th century through the Civil War. And so it's very much a kind of history story. It's a story of the past, but I can't help but think about the ways that that history has affected how we today understand ourselves and how we narrate that history. Mm-hmm. So the fact that enslavers were crafting a landscape that sought to distinguish Black spaces as laboring spaces and white spaces as home places, we can go to a plantation site today and many times continue to see that racialization of home, where in the interpretation at contemporary tourist sites, we see a discussion perhaps of enslaved people, but they're only as laborers. They're only discussed in relation to their work, whereas the enslaving family is the one who is in the home. They talk about them as families. They talk about them in particular ways that kind of perhaps unconsciously, but signal to visitors that Black equals labor, white equals home. Right. And this, I believe, actually has an influence on how we approach the history of segregation, for instance, how we approach the history of inequitable housing policies, which are very much drawn upon racial lines. And so these have this history of the racialization of home that happens in the antebellum era actually affects policy, affects the contemporary Southern landscape, and our interactions with these plantation sites now. Things have changed, I would say, pretty dramatically in some places at some plantation sites over the past 2 decades or so. And some of the plantation sites that I highlight in my book, including Montpelier, including Stagville Plantation, have been at the forefront of those kinds of changes. Another well-known one is Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, which has, particularly because the influence of the descendant community there, as well as one particular scholar, Annette Gordon-Reed, who wrote this fabulous book, The Hemingses of Monticello, which completely changed the way that people saw Monticello as not only a site for Thomas Jefferson, but also for Sally Hemings, among the other many Hemingses who were enslaved there, and the hundreds of other individuals. And so scholars and descendant communities, and now that the public is kind of clamoring for a more complicated and nuanced history of the past, a complicated, nuanced history of not only the Southern past, but the national one. You have people going to sites like Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, which is noted as the only monument to slavery. It's the only plantation that is all about investigating, interrogating enslaved people's lives and beliefs rather than those of the enslavers. You see the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a huge success. I mean, lines out the door, wrapped around the building, all throughout Washington, D.C., waiting to get in because people actually want this more complicated, nuanced history. And other plantations are taking note. They see the work that scholars are doing, the work that descendant communities are doing, and that the fact that the public is actually interested. And many of them are now seeing, not only do we feel compelled to do this because it is the right thing to do, it is correct in terms of the history, it's also the thing to do because it's going to get people into our site. Yeah. Now, quick note though, there have been several articles recently that have talked about changes in the way that plantation sites run, in particular, whether or not they should be opening their site for weddings. Right. Typically weddings of white couples, but not always. And what that says about the plantation site if they're doing that kind of thing. I mean, it's hard when I am, I'm the scholar sitting in the comfy chair and wagging my finger about the fact that they're doing these things when I don't have to be the director worrying about my finances, because these kinds of sites, unless they're a major site funded by huge donors like Monticello or Montpelier, which they're very lucky to have a decent amount of money, although not anything huge, most of these sites are just in desperate need of revenue. So I understand why there would be this possibility, this desire to open up to plantations. But there has been a there has been a lot of discussion around whether or not they should be open. And if they are open and they decide to change their interpretation to include more of enslaved people, there has been a pushback from certain people who want to go to plantation sites just to look at pretty houses and pretty furniture and to hear about the white family. I mean, that's just the kind of honest truth about it. So there's a difficulty from the side of people running these sites about, we know this is the right thing to do. We know people are interested in it. We also know that our traditional base of visitors may end up pushing back. But from my point of view, and what public historians have been arguing for decades when it comes to interpreting difficult history, you have to do the hard work. You do it in a way that shows empathy and openness without closing off people's opinions, but you have to do the ethical thing when it comes to presenting the past.
That sounds, that's so interesting to hear. I mean, again, like it seems frankly very encouraging that you can point to these examples of places that are putting in this work and seeing the public respond. I mean, it's that's really encouraging to hear. I wanted to ask maybe for those who aren't at the, or like maybe for people who are located elsewhere and can't see one of these places in person. I was curious if there might be books or other or websites or something, if someone wants to read a written source on some of these perspectives about home and what it was like. I was just kind of curious. I mean, aside from the book aside from your book, of course, but if there's things that you might just throw out as recommendations to people who want to learn more about this.
Well, first, I want to highlight the work that historians and public historians are doing on these sites. Yeah. Places like Monticello and Montpelier have incredible websites where you can go and learn and tour and get a sense of the place and the people who lived there. You can see letters written by individuals. You can see objects they handled. You can see the buildings. It's not the same as being there, in June, and you see just the glorious mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains right by Montpelier. I mean, it's unbelievable. Yeah. But they do a great job of, particularly in this day and age when it's so hard for us to travel and to go to these sites, which is something that I've been clamoring for because it's one of my favorite things to do. They are doing and putting out as much information and making it as accessible and engaging and entertaining as possible. So that's one thing I would say is just, find a site that you're interested in and see if they have a website that will allow you to get a sense a little bit about what it would like to be there. Mm-hmm. In terms of historical sources, I have to put to the forefront, just like public historians are doing, the lives and experiences of enslaved people, particularly the limited amount of source materials that we have actually written by enslaved and formerly enslaved people. Mm-hmm. There is an incredible website called Documenting the American South, which is a repository for almost every single known slave narrative that was written from the 18th through the early 20th centuries. And you can get a real sense of the breadth of experience of enslaved people across time and space, but also many core similarities of what the status of enslaved and the experience of enslavement was actually like for men and women and children across the United States, even broader throughout the Atlantic world. And it's a harrowing thing in many ways to read these, but as we're recognizing more and more, white fragility cannot be a thing, and we need to encounter and engage with and listen to the voices of Black people and people of color more generally. We need to do that in the past as well. Yeah. So I would say go to Documenting the American South. It is free and open to anyone to read. And I mean, a lot of people know about Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave because of the really phenomenal movie that came out a few years ago. But there are several written by women. Harriet Jacobs in particular, her narrative is heart-wrenching, but also extremely empowering. Mm-hmm. And there are so many others that you could take a look into, and will really open up a different kind of history than you probably even knew was a reality for so many people. 4 million people by 1860 were enslaved in just the United States.
I saw, I think maybe in one of the articles that you'd shared there, the documentation that the WPA had interviewed a number
Yes.
of, yeah, that was just, I mean, in the 30s, as late as the 1930s, they were still, this was their own personal memories of this. It's amazing.
Yeah, so that's another great spot that you can look, and all of those are available. The Works Progress Administration in the 1930s sent out dozens and dozens of interviewers, mostly white, but some Black as well, throughout the United States, to contact and interview formerly enslaved people still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And they found hundreds of them, and many of those people wanted to talk. There are some inconsistencies and some difficulties in using those sources because of, for example, the influence of the white interviewer on the dialect. That's one of the kind of the difficulties in reading these things, but you do get a sense of not only these people's experiences as enslaved people, but during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, many of them begin to talk about what the evolution of the Ku Klux Klan was like on their lives. They talk about the difficulties of Jim Crow and of the Depression, right? 1937, 1938, they're still in the Great Depression. So you get this swath of American history seen through the lens of so many different kinds of people, but many of them having been enslaved themselves, and what that life was like, attempting to, move from slavery to freedom.
Yeah, I wondered. You've met a couple of the points that you've mentioned. I was interested in the kind of, I guess, maybe some of the kind of theoretical ideas that you use. For instance, I believe you'd written about the so-called racialized ideology of home, and you mentioned a few minutes ago the kind of the separation between home, places, and labor, and then I think another source had mentioned that in the past, frequently, I guess, the sort of white perspective was allowed to be more subjective and emotional, and there was this distance where the Black people's experience was somewhat sort of distant and reduced to mere kind of numbers or facts. And so, let me just ask if you could talk about kind of some of the theoretical concepts that you use and how you approach some of those challenges of how to deal with those kind of questions.
Sure. I'm quickly address that last point. This is something that historians of slavery have been grappling with for over 100 years. Yeah. The ways in which, for much of the history, mostly white scholars talk about Black bodies, which were used and were classified as property, sometimes fall into a more economic, almost inhumane way of discussing these human beings. And so we see across the last century or so a kind of roller coaster of how scholars have talked about and written about enslaved people. And in particular, over the past 10 years or so, there's been a movement to investigate the relationship between the rise of capitalism in the Atlantic world and the globe more generally or more broadly, and the rise of the institution of racialized slavery, and seeing the connections and the ways in which both supported one another and one helped the other grow and vice versa. Yeah. And there's been some of the work that's been done, very important work that's helped us understand how economics actually is intertwined with the social and legal systems, but has done unfortunately, some of that same kind of, we call it cliometrics, and seeming to be more interested in the ways that human beings are commodities, and then using numbers more than anything else, or generalized discussion of enslaved people instead of really trying to understand people as individuals, individual beliefs and actions and things of that sort. So we actually see a bit of a swing back. So we had a kind of swing towards one side and we're swinging back. I mean, that's in many ways how historiography and history works, is that we tend to overcorrect and then we'll go another way. And for myself, at least, I'm trying to fall in the middle of not overgeneralizing, but also making sure that I can tell a broad enough story that I feel like it has some resonance across the US South. Yeah. And so trying to find some balance between those two things. So that's one issue. In terms of other theoretical underpinnings of my work, I have to, once again, foreground the work and the words of people of color. Mm-hmm. Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, Black feminist scholars are an essential part of my theoretical study. And so Bell Hooks, among other people, has talked about the ways that this idea of home place is one where enslaved women and later Black women, free Black women, were using space in a way to, using space as a form of resistance against oppression, resistance against violence to their bodies, to their children, etc. And so I think about the idea of home place and I bring it into my work and I try to find ways that enslaved women and men and children actually physically tried to make this home place. How did they physically enact resistance in home space? What kind of objects did they use or create? How did they build their houses? Did they leave a particular kind of quartz or bead somewhere? They place it underneath the structure of their house to signify a kind of hope for protection in this space that was so often intruded upon and surveilled on by enslavers, by overseers, etc. And so the idea of home place is one that I have adopted from Black feminist scholars that has been a really central part of my work. I've also been slowly creating a kind of theoretical structure for this concept of homemaking. And it's something I use the gerund very intentionally rather than, saying rather than creating any other word, I want to emphasize the action of it. Because when people sometimes think of history and they think of primary sources like a document or a piece of furniture or a painting, it just seems so static. And I think by emphasizing the fact that these are things that were constantly made and constantly having value put upon them and having them be revalued and having them be used in different ways, it helps people to understand that history is something that people were living, that it was constantly changing. And the idea that enslaved individuals were constantly attempting to make home, even amidst, the constraints that were placed upon them were unlike many that we could even recognize in terms of the physical constraints, the emotional constraints, the psychological constraints, the resources, the time. They did not have time that was their own in many ways. And so the small amount of time that they did have matters so much. And investigating what they did in that moment can tell us a lot about their lives, their beliefs, their identities.
Yeah. Wow, that's so intriguing. I'm sure everyone will be thrilled to read the book when it comes out, because it seems like, it's such a story of struggle, but at the same time, it sounds like there's a lot, to really admire in what they were able to do in those circumstances. I wondered, maybe kind of continuing on the. I guess some of the more kind of thinking about the subjective experiences. I know that you mentioned the whole question of weddings and that briefly a little earlier, and there's certainly been a lot in the news about this question of could places like these ever be appropriate, and should they not? And I couldn't help thinking of the line from Walter Benjamin that every document of civilization is at the same time a document of barbarism. And I was thinking of that kind of the image of these places. One of the articles that I think you shared by Chase Quinn, stating essentially that he thought the romance of plantations could even be more dangerous in a way than Confederate statues, because these places are, the aesthetic or the beauty of the landscape and so forth. Like it has this pull on people, and people want to get have their weddings there, at the same time blocking out or shutting out the oppression and the suffering that happened. And I guess my question would be, how do you think about kind of this, the romantic or the beautiful, like how would you suggest that people try and deal with that, or whether there's any way of reckoning with that at all, or I don't know how to put it exactly, but what maybe just kind of what your thoughts are on the romance side, and how to try and struggle with that, I guess.
It is a real pull. It is an easy thing to fall into. I study this stuff for a living. I know the real history. I go to these sites and I just sometimes, mouth agape just how glorious these spaces and these buildings and these settings are. It is true. This is why they were built this way. Yeah. They are meant to be statements of the enslavers' identity and status and belief system. What I have to constantly remind myself of is the fact that just because something is beautiful doesn't mean that there's not more to the story than that.
Yeah, yeah.
When I teach American history at UTD, I want my students to walk away not feeling like the United States is a crappy country, but rather thinking that our past and our present and our future is really complicated. Yeah. And there is a lot that has been bad. There is a lot that has been good. There's even more that has been,
yeah.
But that is the reality of the human experience, that all of these things that are beautiful have an underlying element of darkness. And just like those things that might seem dark on the surface have an underlying element of beauty and bright and hope. Yeah. That there is never something that is as simple as beauty. Because beauty is a historically contingent concept, and it was created by people at a particular time who held certain beliefs, not all of them good. Yeah. That is for me the power of these sites, is that they can, if interpreted correctly, help visitors to get a sense of the complicated nature of the American past. And that's one reason why I think that if we continue to have these spaces, these places open to the public, we have to do a good enough job to where people are going to walk away and not just think, wow, that was a really pretty house. They can think, wow, that was a really pretty house, but I really hope they're thinking something else. Like, that was a really pretty house. And can you believe that it took 24 enslaved carpenters 5 months to complete the renovations in 1790 when they were having to be separated from their families who lived on another plantation? I wonder what that was like for them.
Yeah.
Just more to the American past than celebration. There's also more than just condemnation.
Yeah. I think that's so amazingly well put in. You mentioned teaching and students and so forth, and I was just thinking about how, well, certainly everywhere, but certainly at UTD, I mean, there's so many people, not only visitors, but families or communities who are immigrants to this country and who are, coming upon these places and this history, for the first time, and they may in some way feel like outsiders, but as soon as one, I guess, joins into participating in this country, one is confronted with it, and it must be, it must be both challenging, but also very inspiring to see students and everyone kind of struggle with this or kind of ponder this for the first time.
It is really wonderful to have students from other countries not have a background, not have kind of preconceived notions of what they're going to get when they take a US history class.
Yeah.
To not, I want that, because I need to know, well, if you were coming from India, what do you think about, what do you think about the Civil War?
Yeah.
You don't care about it? I understand. Well, here's a little bit about it, and
Yeah.
here's why it actually continues to be really important to the fact that you are in this country right now. That tells us something. What happened in the past can tell us something about your present. Everything, it's hard because sometimes students can't feel an easy, direct connection between 1790 and today. But then you start talking about the debates over the Bill of Rights. You start talking about religious freedom. You start talking about the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, for instance, is something that's talked a lot about in regards to monuments. That's a conversation that they are hearing, that they're engaging with. These are things that have a much longer history than just what happened a couple of weeks ago. And understanding that long history gives them a much better base from which to make their own decisions and form their own beliefs around some of the most essential inequitable rights that we hold.
Yeah. Well, our guest today is Dr. Whitney Stewart, and her book, which will be called This Is Our Home, The Struggle for Home Place on Southern Plantations, will be coming out from the University of North Carolina Press. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Ben. It was so much fun.